The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A public hearing around the potential rezoning of lands near Cable Bay Trail is set for a third session this week. With Nanaimo receiving 907 written submissions about the proposal and more than 100 people speaking to the matter in person or over the phone so far, there has been significant community interest in the matter. Today on the program, we'll hear from an expert on planning about the public hearing process and some of the dimensions being considered in this case. First, some background. Nanaimo Forest Products, also known in the community as Harmac, has applied to rezone close to 75 hectares of land in the southeastern part of Nanaimo from Rural Resource AR1 to Industrial I4 land. The land was purchased by Nanaimo Forest Products in the spring of 2022. Nanaimo's official community plan, adopted in summer 2022, envisions the lands as one day being zoned industrial. The land in question is directly west of the Cable Bay Trail, with plans for a buffer zone averaging 100 meters to be left in place between the trail and any future land use. A representative from Nanaimo Forest Products has said during the public hearing that the company plans to lease out the land to interested parties that have synergy with their business. There has also been talk during the hearing about tentative plans for a Windset Farms greenhouse and temporary farm worker housing on the lands if the bylaw is approved. The public hearing began on April 16th with a second session Wednesday, April 22nd. The third session is set for Thursday evening this week. You can find our coverage of the first two sessions on our website at chly.ca/news. Mark Holland is one of the principals at West Plan Consulting Group. He also teaches planning at Vancouver Island University. I spoke with him to dive into some of the details on the public hearing process, zoning rules, and some of what Nanaimo City Council will need to weigh in making their decision.
So my name is Mark Holland. I am a real estate development consultant, a city planner, and a professor at Vancouver Island University, just retiring there this year from 10 years of teaching planning and real estate development at the university.
And you have graciously agreed to give me some of your time to talk a little bit about planning and zoning and public hearings and some of the rules and procedures and practices around these. Maybe the place to start, so we're in the midst of a public hearing process for some proposed zoning changes for lands around Cable Bay. Could you just give me some context on, in a situation like this, how does the public hearing process work? When does something go to public hearing? When does something not go to public hearing? And what is that hearing meant to do?
Okay, that's a great way to start. It's a great starting place. So local governments are given the powers by the province to control land use. And they control land use through two ways. One is the official community plan, which is the macro city plan. Establishes sort of broad-based areas. They call them land designations. And in this case, the last official community plan update that happened a year or two ago redesignated, or it's a little more than that, I think 2022, redesignated the Cable Bay area from its previous designation, which was a master planned luxury resort community with golf courses. They redesignated it to industrial. So there was a fulsome multi-year process. Now, it was during COVID, so it was a little bit tough then, but where this whole conversation happened around how this area should be industrial. So the conversation that we're in here today started really seriously with that move several years ago. The next layer of control that a local government has is zoning. Now, this is a much more granular control of what happens on land use, rather than just, big picture industry and big picture residential. This is down to the exact businesses or land uses that are permitted. It's quite common that an official community plan and zoning will be out of step with each other. This is a historical practice Today, the province is asking them to get them a lot more aligned, but they still don't line up often for commercial industrial. Most of that is for residential, where they want them aligned. But we often end up doing then a rezoning to change the current zone to match what the official community plan says, which is what we're doing here. And that's where everything suddenly gets really real. An official community plan has a lot of motherhoods in it. Zoning has detailed lists and exact meters of how height and setbacks and everything come up. And that's what you're seeing in this conversation today. So how a zoning process works is an applicant will frequently take a year, 2 years. I do a lot of these. They can take 3, 4, 5 years in some cases. Coming up with the right application. There's a lot of pre-work with staff before you put your application in, often a lot of conversations to make sure that everybody understands and generally is okay with the direction the project is going. Then you formally submit the application, and that starts a multi-cycle review process with staff, with other agencies, First Nations, etc. So this application has been through that review process multiple times. They held their open house in 2023. During that process, we usually hold a public open house, sometimes near the beginning, often kind of fairly well along. If you hold it at the beginning, then you get everybody's comments right away. But what you're showing may not actually be what happens, and then you often have to hold another one. If you wait till you've had a little more negotiation with city staff, and Toby Seward, who's leading this, is highly experienced in this process, then what you're showing everyone is kind of pretty close to probably what may ultimately happen. There will still be a few changes, but it's pretty close to what's going to happen. So that's where we're at here. So the public hearing obviously is now multi-nights. There's so many speakers. And I expect that the landowner and maybe the city are a little uneasy or maybe even surprised at the level. I haven't talked with them, but the level of response, given that this was designated as industrial during the whole multi-year OCP process. They've held a public meeting a couple of years ago, and they've been working forward on this. This level of reaction is pretty formidable, and particularly in an election year. So what the public hearing process is, it's legislated by the province that any rezoning, except for housing projects that have more than 50% housing and are in alignment with the OCP, you're not allowed to have a public hearing. They don't want the politics around that anymore. The province is part of their housing agenda. But this is an industrial site, so it has a public hearing. And the public hearing, as you've seen and experienced, is essentially an open arena of folks coming to the microphone. Anybody who feels they want to talk about it can come. They can usually, they have a time limit, but they can come back and talk as many times as they want. And so for big contentious projects like this one is turning out to be, it's not unusual to have multi-evening public hearings. What happens next is when they've completed the public hearing, we then end up in a little cone of silence for a short period of time. Sometimes it can be long, but usually short. Occasionally, the council will actually make the decision on the final night of the public hearing. But in many cases, they can decide, and they do it both ways. More frequently, they will close the public hearing, and they will consider between then and the next council meeting, and then they will make their decision at the council meeting. They don't replay the public hearing. People can't talk about it. The key thing is that in that window between the closure of the public hearing and when council makes the decision, no one is permitted to talk to council about the application, because there's a legal rule that says no new information can be introduced into that process. So even staff really don't talk to council very much during those periods of time, other than to answer questions. I've seen some of those. We were involved in one that lasted for years in between the two, and it was just everybody wanted it to go forward, so they pushed it forward in the end for us. But in this case, I expect it will happen. Well, a couple of options. If the politics are so hot and scary, this council may postpone that conversation to after the election. So that is one option. I kind of doubt they'll do that, but I don't know for sure. Normally, they would want to get this thing approved or turned down and move forward. So if they approve it then it moves forward. There's a small legal window, so we call that third reading. The first and second readings are the ones that come before, and that kind of starts the process. After the application has been reviewed and council and staff take it to council, then you go to public hearing, then you go to third reading. So that's usually when they make the decision. There's almost always some legal requirements that follow between third and fourth. So, different commitments, agreements, covenants, whatever else has to be attached to the title. So there's a short window of time there. And if there's any new conditions council puts on it, then they have to be met. And then it comes back for an administrative approval called fourth reading. Now, the one interesting thing here, Joe, is that the administrative approvals typically go like this. Maybe you get a 5-4 vote in favor of the project at third reading, so it gets approved, but you have councillors who voted against it. At fourth reading, pretty much everybody votes for it because the political decision was made at third reading, except in election years. So there is a real possibility here that this thing dragging on, even if this council approves it, if they don't get all the legal work and get back to council for fourth reading before the election, then it's the future council that will be the ones that receive the fourth reading. And usually in every election cycle, there are a few very political projects that get voted against at fourth reading. In fact, they become election issues. So this project is sitting on some, this is a challenging time for everybody involved in this project when there's this much opposition for it after so many years kind of in its walk up to this point.
There is so much to get into on this project and on what you just said there. Maybe starting most pragmatically with something you touched on a little bit there of when people can expect this decision to be made. You've suggested that the rules do allow for council at the end of any one of these public hearing nights to go directly into their decision and their debate, but that is usually not the case that happens. And it's likely that folks can expect perhaps at an upcoming council meeting within a week or two, that's when the big meaty debate would happen and people would get some clarity on what the elected officials decide to do with this? That's
correct. That would be normal procedure, but they do sometimes make the decision right there. And they can call an end to the public hearing anytime they want. This is their process. They are the sovereign council of the local government to do this. I expect, because it's an election year and because there's a lot of organized opposition, that they probably will let this thing kind of run its course through all the speakers. And I would put money on the fact they won't make the decision right there on the spot that evening. They're going to want to review what was said and think about it. They may come back with some requirements. Sometimes when it gets this hot, council comes back and says, okay, subject to these 3 things we want you to address, then we'll approve it. So in this case, since a lot of the anger, we can talk about First Nations in a moment. The First Nations is a whole different dimension of this conversation. In my discussion right now, I'm just sticking to the technical process of how these happen. They might come back and say, well, right now there's a 100-meter setback. Folks are asking for 200. If you're prepared to give us 150 meters, then we'll let that go. So there might be a little bit of a discussion that happens as they set those terms and move forward. But it's a gray area. Typically, they don't do too much of that negotiating at this stage because it can be seen as new information. If new information is formally introduced, the public hearing is considered moot, and they have to go back and do the public hearing again, and no one wants to do that. So yeah, I would expect they would probably give themselves a little bit of political thinking time to discuss it, think what they're going to do, and then they would make their vote on it. They can either approve it as proposed, maybe with a few minor conditions. They can send it back to staff to work with the applicant and say, listen, we need you to go back and renegotiate this. So they can essentially defer it back to staff, and then you would come back through the process again, or they can deny it outright, at which point then the applicant usually has to wait up to about 6 months, typically, to resubmit. In most municipalities, they have to wait about 6 months before they can resubmit basically the same or a similar application if they want to try again.
You referred to one of the parts of this that has been contentious for some people, a setback there. Right now, as it's proposed, it's going to be an average of 100 meters of setback. Some people taking objection to the fact that in some zones in the proposal it's only 50. It was something that some folks at the public hearing have spoken to so far. You mentioned you were speaking there to maybe more broadly members of the public and some of the things that they have been saying during this public hearing. There's also the dimension of this of the First Nation. Nanaimo First Nation has come out and they have formally raised issues with this rezoning process in this public hearing. To use some of their words of their press release, they strongly advised the city against, again, the words from the press release, pushing a rushed rezoning process over treaty-protected lands without Nanaimo consent. If we're just talking about public hearings for zoning changes in general, is there any kind of formally recognized procedure or convention in local governance about having the blessing of the local First Nation prior to approving a zoning change like this?
It's a very good question, Joe. The issue of First Nations and zoning is not really legally defined in local government bylaws in most cases. So each local government has control of their own procedures, bylaws, and their own policies, so they can establish those. And if you look at most local governments, they have lots of positive language in their official community plan about reconciliation and, working with First Nations. Most local governments have working relationships with the First Nations in and around their territory because First Nations have certainly a lot of moral rights today in an era of reconciliation. They also have increasing legal and treaty rights in these areas. Nanaimo has not settled their treaty with the federal and provincial governments at the moment. So they are in negotiations. Lands have come up, and basically the deal has been done that they will be part of treaty, such as the D&D lands up in on VIU. And in full disclosure, I'm playing a very small role on a team that is working on the comprehensive plan for the Nanaimo up in that area. I also completed one of the Nanaimo's comprehensive community plans about 10, 12 in the 2000s for them for their current reserves. So I've had some ongoing relationships with them. So in this case, they have not completed their treaty. So when they assert that these are, lands covered by their treaty, I'm not privy to all the details of those negotiations, but they're certainly core lands that were part of their core territory for thousands of years.
Well, I believe in that case the treaty being referenced is the 1854 Sarlequin Treaty. Some people might be familiar with hearing talk about the Douglas treaties on the southern part of Vancouver Island, indeed up to here in what we're now calling Nanaimo. So I believe that is throughout this public hearing process when the Nanaimo, either in the press releases or elders speaking at the public hearings themselves, have been talking about treaty lands. You've mentioned that there's the ongoing negotiations around a kind of a more modern treaty, but I believe that 1854 treaty is what's being referenced.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But they are updating it to establish a modern treaty under the modern terms, which grant them, significant, powerful rights on land. But typically, most local governments, that's not how this works. Now, we need to remember what happened on the Howard Johnson site. So on the Howard Johnson site, that was a development proposal right in the downtown of the old city of Nanaimo on the Millstream River. That had a site that was previously settled by the Nanaimo, and the City Hall, the Nanaimo City Council approved that project, and then the province stepped in and purchased the land and gave it to the Nanaimo as part of the modern treaty process. So there is precedent in this area for sort of tri-party negotiations of where a senior government will buy private land when the Nanaimo have established a strong cultural, economic, or other interest to that land, and they will negotiate with the Nanaimo to bring that into the modern treaty process. So we don't know if that's what's going on here. That was the last time this sort of happened in a big way, highly public way, was then at the Howard Johnson site. So we can't know what's going on. I mean, the Nanaimo's rights to this land, it's ancestral territory. It's covered by those early treaties 150 years ago or more, and and things, governments did not honor these. So this is kind of unknown territory and how it moves forward. So you'll find, yeah. So that's what I would say, is that that's really what we're looking at here. We don't know what this means. They've done archaeological work on the site, so they've spent quite a bit of money and time, from what I understand. Like, if they did an AIA, a full investigative review, they were out there with shovels, and it can take a year just to get the permit to do that. So they've spent time and looked at it through the formal process that is typically required for development approvals. It's an archaeological process. So they've done that work and found out whatever the assets were in the area. I have not had a chance to review their whole AIA to understand exactly what came out of it. But clearly, the Nanaimo feel deeply and strongly that they have some pretty powerful cultural, moral, even economic rights to that land, legal rights to that land. So that really complicates the process for City Hall, because they don't really have, they only can control land use, and they have formal processes, and if they don't follow them, they can be sued for that. So they kind of have to operate following the steps and procedures that their own bylaws require, and that rule pretty much all land use approvals. So this becomes a new complicating factor that now brings the province to the table, when Nanaimo takes such a strong position against this project. Or they didn't take a position against the project. They took a position, as I understand it, of wanting more time to do proper consultation, engagement, and consider, deal with this, because they see it as important lands for their core territory and cultural uses. But what that actually means, to answer it's a long-winded and non-answer to your question, Joe, which is no, there isn't a formal process. There isn't even really there's not local government legislation that formally inserts First Nations into the land approvals process outside of, modern provincial treaties. So this is definitely it's definitely an unknown factor as to what City Hall will do with this.
So really just another thing for each individual councillor to consider as they make their decision, without some kind of precedent or accepted practice or protocol to kind of hang their hat on.
And it's very complicated, because, Nanaimo's council is a pretty high functioning council. They have had their ups and downs with their First Nations relationships over time. The Nanaimo are pretty robust and strong. They're, as far as modern First Nations go, modern urban First Nations, they're organized and structured and effective in how they engage governments. And again, because I'm working with them, I can see that from inside. It's very well organized. They're very effective in how they interact with governments. They have some successes here with the city of Nanaimo in getting some rights, looked after. So yeah, it becomes pretty complicated as to how they're going to deal with it. The challenge is that no local government wants to default hand a veto to any First Nation about land, anything that happens within their jurisdiction, their local government jurisdiction, outright. So they don't. I think it's unlikely, and it's not for any other reason than just, the wheels of how a community works. Yeah, they'll have some interesting conversations to have with themselves about what they want to do about that, because how they deal with the Nanaimo on any given piece of land begins to set a precedent for how they kind of need to deal with them on other pieces of land. So they have a challenge for them here, particularly in largely a legally unknown territory, because they don't have formal veto status. They're a referral agency, but yeah, so there's a lot of agencies that comments are sought from. Provincial ministries, BC Hydro, there's many of them that information is sought from, and generally the municipality then they adjudicate the information they get and decide what to do about it. So in this case, this is no different. The First Nations have come out, written and verbal, and said, we don't want this approved now, and for a bunch of reasons. And so now it's up to the local government to decide what to do with that. But it sort of sets a precedent for future projects, and that makes everybody uneasy. It doesn't mean that they're trying. I would suggest that Nanaimo City Council generally would not be trying to complicate or negatively impact the Nanaimo. They're a pretty upstanding bunch, but this is going to be a challenge for them.
Another dimension to this, a concern raised by speakers at the public hearing, is that if this zoning change is approved and the zoning becomes I-4, people have expressed a concern that the local elected government loses future power to kind of determine exactly what type of industrial use happens on the lands in question in the future. Can you speak to that concern that's been raised by people about what the city is able to do if this zoning goes ahead, as far as dictating like what industrial uses will happen on the land?
Yep. So that is a fair concern, Joe, for at this stage. The fact that the community are concerned about having little to no influence over what kind of uses can occur after the rezoning is accurate. Zoning is the decision whereby the land uses are determined. Now, there are other approvals yet to come, but they don't impact zoning. They don't impact land use. That's this decision. The approvals that will be yet to come, they'll have subdivision, where they take the big zoned parcel and they break it up into smaller pieces and decide where the roads are going to go. And if there's any, things like setbacks, then no build areas, they have to put all those on the land through subdivision. And it's at that time that they typically also put in the roads, the sanitary, water, power systems, etc. So that's the first kind of servicing of the subdivision that happens in order to get lots surveyed out and registered with the land titles office so they can be sold or developed. The other piece is that on any given lot then that they would want to develop, there will be development permits required. So the development permits generally in this case are going to, there may be some attention to form and character, but mostly they're going to be environmental permits. So things like riparian and aquifer protection and sensitive ecospecies, ecosystems, things like that. So there are, and then ultimately before anything can be built, building permits have to be taken out. So there is multiple permits still ahead, many different things that have to be addressed, but not land use. So the zoning, this rezoning process establishes the list of uses of what can happen here.
Could you walk me through on some of those permits that would need to happen in the future? What is the involvement of, say, like elected officials versus city staff? What is the decision-making process like on that one when whoever is going to be operating something on the land in whatever hypothetical future comes and says, this is what we want to do? How do those decisions get made?
So the subdivision decision for how to basically parcel up the site and the design of the roads and water and sewer systems and everything, that's a staff decision. So that is actually a parallel decision governed under the province. The person who makes that decision is in City Hall, but they're known as the approving authority, the subdivision approving authority. I believe it's the director of planning. If it's not, it'll be the CAO or the director of engineering. I can't remember which it is in Nanaimo. Sorry, too many towns in my head. So that's a staff decision. Development permits, sometimes they're approved by staff. Sometimes they're approved by council, depending on which community you're in. Generally, we would presume if it's going to be in any way contentious, it would be approved by council. Most times they're approved by council. For things like housing and things that are all OCP compliant and everything compliant, these are sometimes delegated to staff. And increasingly, cities are trying to delegate development permits to staff because it's really a technical process of did the design meet the requirements and did you have the right reports and things like that. I would, yeah, this one here is hard to say. I would expect this goes back through council. I have not checked their development procedures bylaw to know exactly when they delegate in this one. There's 3 development permit areas. So this one's under environmentally sensitive areas, DPA 1. It's also under the wildfire hazard one, so DPA 5, and it does have an industrial form and character, which means there is some guidelines around landscaping and buildings and how they're sited and things like this. They won't be onerous. This is an industrial site, and industrial form and character guidelines, they're not like urban ones for housing and commercial. These are very, very general. So it's not really going to address the nature. There'll be industrial buildings with chain link fences and parking lots, maybe a little bit of landscaping. There might be a few guidelines around signage and things like that, but it's not going to be an onerous set of lists. So those are the only 3 things that we can talk about now after if the zoning gets approved. And those, the environmentally sensitive areas, that's the environmental impact assessment map that was done will establish where they are and any specific practices required to protect them. Wildfire hazard is mostly how you deal with the trees around your buildings. So generally keeping trees away from buildings. In the case of industrial sites, they're pretty much all cleared anyway. So that's just the nature of industrial development will probably take care of any wildfire hazard concerns. So they don't have a lot more control over what's going to happen, and they certainly will not be, you're not permitted to use like form and character guidelines to try and influence whether a use is actually feasible if it is permitted. You can't use them to get in the way. So this is the decision that determines whether a chemical plant can be allowed on that site.
And my understanding is that Nanaimo Forest Products is interested in leasing out the land to interested industry that they feel kind of lines up and has some synergy with whatever they're doing, but there's a bit of a chicken and egg too. They're looking to get this rezoning done before necessarily they figure out exactly what that is. When it comes to the list of things permitted under I-4 zoning, it's pretty long. There are a number of wildly different things that are permitted. There is a use that is just the single word industry that is a permitted use on I-4 zoning. Can you give me a sense of maybe especially what does that mean when industry is a permitted use as far as what is and isn't allowed?
It's a really good question, Joe, about what's permitted in these zones. Zoning is for all of its legal power, it's a pretty inexact science in BC. There is no reference zoning bylaw. There is no agreement on the definition of any use. You can look at any zoning bylaw and you will find that a different definition applies to nearly every single word. There's a lot of us who are making quite a bit of noise saying we need to change that. We need to get a systematic set of definitions and a reference zoning bylaw that all planners can kind of buy into and use in these cases. But zoning bylaws are pretty archaic and pretty frustrating to use frequently. And thus you end up in this kind of situation where the I-4 zone has a long list of uses. Now it's a heavy industry zone. So this is livestock processing, log sorting, salvages and wrecking yards for vehicles, topsoil processing, waste transfer stations, truck terminals. Like this is heavy. A lot of the uses permitted here are not friendly to their neighbors. And this is why we have a I-4 zone. And this is partly why council chose to put it out here, is there aren't very many neighbors. Now, you might not believe that in the public hearing with all the neighbors coming out, but realistically, there's not a high density residential area anywhere close to this. That's all rural residential pretty much. And one of their neighbors is basically close to an ocean. The other neighbor is a Harmac pulp mill, which is one of the heaviest industries that we know because it's got lots of smell and trucks and noise and lights, etc. So this is a very long list of uses. You make a note that the word industry is also a use, and it has its own definition. So in most of these cases, we would go to the definitions section of the zoning bylaw, and we would ask, what is beverage processing? What is a composting facility? Because as I mentioned, nobody defines it the same way. So every city kind of defines it for themselves. By including a general word industry here, And when you look at the definition, what they're trying to do, even though they have a lot of specific uses listed, they're trying to basically say, well, and pretty much anything else that is kind of like that is what they're saying. So it provides for the cogeneration, manufacturing, processing, assembling, fabricating, testing, servicing, repair, storing, transporting, warehousing, or distributing of goods and materials or things with or without an ancillary office, just, et cetera, to administer the industrial use of the lot. And it includes some wholesaling, provided that what's being sold basically is what's happening there, but excludes the processing of fish, live animals, poultry, and other fowl. So I don't think an abattoir is permitted here in this list. Normally it would be. Livestock processing, yes, it is. So that basically says is that if you are running a concrete asphalt plant, then all of the other things that might happen there, such as manufacturing, processing, testing, servicing, storing, you're allowed to do all of that for any of these uses. So from an industrial point of view, this is a smart way to have zoning, is that you put all, for heavy industry, you put a big long list of uses here that are not good neighbors to other uses, except uses like them that are as noxious as they are. So you have a log sorting factory, or you have a log sorting yard next to a livestock processing abattoir. They're fine. They're fine with each other. They don't, you're out there. The folks who are running the abattoir don't mind smelling all those logs sitting out there in the wet rain, because that's really quite an intense smell for any neighbor. Likewise, the sound of an abattoir processing a huge load of animals that gets dropped off, the folks in the log sort don't care. So this is when we're putting together zones, we kind of look that way for what kind of uses can we put together that won't have a conflict with each other, particularly in industry. Now, best practice would normally be to include the biggest list you can, because the alternative to that, Joe, is to constantly go back and fight another rezoning. And we're really bad with that in BC with our zoning bylaws. You'll find zoning bylaws with just a few uses in them, which means, you can run a retail store, but you can't run a hairdresser. Well, a retail store has a much greater level of impact on its neighbors. So we should be able to have a hairdresser there if, the retail store or the corner store goes out of business and we want to put a hairdresser in it. No, you frequently have to go back and get it rezoned. Takes a year, 2 years, maybe $100,000 sometimes, $50,000 in studies and work. It depends on what happens, So generally, best practice would be to have the bigger list rather than the shorter list, so as to not become an unnecessary roadblock to employment and economic development. However, that may be best practice generally, but when you get a list like this and folks go, a chemical plant. So I went looking for a chemical plant. I started looking at some of these. There is no definition of a chemical plant, so we don't know what a chemical plant. When I've written zoning bylaws, I've distinctly separated types of things like chemical plants or chemical manufacturing of sorts, because some of them are, they're making soap. Some of them are making cleaners for your house, and they're small, local, and organic. Other ones are, a natural gas refinery. So we don't know what a chemical plant is here. And that's that when there's that lack of clarity, then people can get pretty uneasy because we just don't know. The probability of any major chemical plant going in here is very small. These sites don't match the kind of characteristics that a major chemical plant investor would want. There's no highway. We're on an island. We don't have easy access for all the raw materials, both coming in and then all the products going out. We have a very small workforce, of which not a lot of them are going to be chemical engineers, etc. So it's unlikely anything super noxious or dangerous would happen here just because of market forces. But without a definition, folks get worried.
Well, a natural follow-up question to that would be is there any kind of possible way to address that concern? Is there any kind of, option for, say, the council to put some different conditions or have different kinds of I-4 zoning, which would bring us to, there was a motion from a city councillor, Paul Manley, in November of last year, more or less aiming to try and do that. It would have made certain uses, including chemical plants, site-specific, which would require specific approval. that motion passed to get, well, the motion to get a staff report investigating the feasibility of that passed 5-4. That staff report has not come out prior to this process. All of that is to say, maybe that is some context behind the question. Like, what is it like if council were to investigate the possibility of trying to address that concern people have raised?
It's easy to address, so it's a good question. And these kinds of questions, these concerns around specific land uses or potential impacts are actually relatively easy to address in zoning. So this would be potentially one of those conditions I mentioned when I talked about the process and how council can put conditions on zoning. So there's a section in each zone, or it may not be in each zone, but typically in many zones, there's a section called sort of special regulations at the end of that zone. And what we find here often in zoning bylaws is address-specific statements. And those address-specific statements may add some additional constraints. They may remove some of the uses, or they may add additional uses, or they may change some other factor in the zoning. They can address any of the components of zoning, heights or uses or setbacks or anything like that. So that's the first and easiest way. The other way is you switch from I-4 to a CD zone, what we call a comprehensive development zone, which essentially is a blank piece of paper. So Joe, you and I could create a CD zone for a site and say, well, what do we want to have on here? Well, we'd like some housing for the folks who work there, and we'd like a little store. Okay, retail's permitted. And you basically go through and here's our vision, and you just write the zone to match the vision. Both are available to them here. They have come basically, most city staff try and use what we call district schedules. I-4 is a schedule of zoning that covers a whole district. And it's the same, and every time it touches ground, it's the same, unless a special regulation for that address has been written. So what they could do here, to say the question of a chemical plant, they could say a special regulation that for this address or parcel identifier numbers, anyone in this area, chemical plants are not permitted. So the I-4 zone still stands, but as you read down to the end, you find your address there and it says, but you can't put a chemical plant here. Or there's some other criteria for some of these, like it can only be so large, or has to be a certain distance from something. So we can kind of put a set of clauses that further control uses and other aspects of zoning for one parcel at the end. That's the simplest way for the city of Nanaimo to address this issue. If by taking a couple of these uses out, people calm down and their anxiety begins to pull back a bit, that would be the easiest way to do it.
You've also talked a little bit about the environmental assessment that has been done as part of the application. One of the conditions on the bylaw as written, if it were to pass, is the registration of a Section 219 covenant to develop the subject property in accordance with the recommendations from that environmental assessment that's already been prepared, and to provide a detailed biophysical assessment prior to land-altering activity. And I'm wondering if you could translate to me what exactly that means.
Okay. So an environmental impact assessment, an EIA as we call them, is a study that is done on any given piece of land, usually large pieces of land. We don't do them for small urban lots. We're an arborist. But for a big piece of land like this, we do an EIA. And they go out there and they look and identify with some surveyors where the streams are, where key setbacks are. They walk the site looking for birds' nests, raptors' nests. They monitor where all the species are growing. They look for areas which either have habitat or might have some evidence of species that are considered protected in some form, red, blue, green, or yellow listed species, or any other, and some maybe some key native species of note. So they provide maps, and then they provide recommendations for best practices in dealing with these. So this is a Section 219 covenant is the legal duct tape. It's legal crazy glue. What it does is it glues something to that property. So 219s glue things to property. So that's what this is. Using a Section 219, we're going to glue the EIA report and the recommendations in it to this property. Otherwise, the report sits there, right? We know this information in the report, but really it's sort of moral suasion and best practices for how one would go about altering the site. The development permit areas are usually how we then develop the site, and they are usually written by qualified environmental professionals, the kinds that do EIAs. So often it's what they're doing there is belt and suspenders. They have DPs, they have development permit areas for environment there on the site already, and now they're going to also glue the EIA report to that site with that covenant. So that then means that when any development permit application comes in, or building permit applications, or even subdivision, the city planners have to review those with the recommendations from the EIA, not just their own development permit guidelines, but now they have that report open on their desk too, and they're going to be going back and forth and going, are you following these rules? It also clearly, because it's on title, it runs with the land no matter who owns it. So if whoever buys it, it's still sitting on title, that they have to make sure that EIA is in the hands of the people who are working for them to decide what they want to develop and make sure they're following all the recommendations to the best possible way.
So there have been more than 900 written submissions on this. As we're having this conversation now, the public hearing is set to go into its third session, with both of the other ones going from kind of 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., all first-time speakers, 3 minutes each, and they haven't run out of people to speak. Can you give me a sense for, in a community the size of Nanaimo, how common is it for that volume of engagement to happen at a public hearing?
Very rare. This is a very contentious project to have gone for 3 nights still on your first round of speakers, and to have 900 submissions. That is very uncommon. We're used to land use decisions. They're always contentious. There are changes in a community. People perceive some will win, some will lose. Human nature, behavioral economics shows us that we overvalue what we fear we will lose over what might be gained. And in the case of land use decisions, the folks who are immediately nearby are the ones impacted. The benefits go to everybody. So like a strong industrial base out here, again, notwithstanding the First Nations, okay, I'm talking generically here. Strong industrial bases provide lots of jobs and lots of tax revenue to the community. So the community largely, wins in that regard. Again, notwithstanding First Nations and their concerns about changes to their ancestral territories and treaty territories. But the people who live nearby, they're the ones that get the traffic. They're the ones that see the lights, they smell the smells, they hear the noise, etc. So that's typically what happens. So to have that many people for a rural site like this come out, that is very interesting. There's a lot of organizing going on in this network to get a lot of people to come out and actually come out physically in person and speak about this, which, to be honest with you, I find a little bit surprising, given that they've already gone through an OCP process that was multi-year and pretty detailed to turn this into industrial. And I was around during that time. I wasn't closely involved in it. I live in Victoria now, so I'm not quite as closely as I used to live in Nanaimo, so I was much closer to it then. But I don't remember significant opposition to this becoming an industrial area. In fact, there were a lot of people, I think, who were pleased with that, because the previous plan to put 1,500, 2,000 homes out there in the Cable Bay golf course community model, that would have created a lot of traffic, as lots of people, anybody who shopped or worked, drove all the way in, basically from Harmac all the way in every day and back. There was a lot of anxiety about traffic. So industry has a much lower employment density, we call it. You'll have 10 employees for a huge warehouse kind of a thing, whereas an office building of the same size might have hundreds, even thousands of employees. So generally we see it as less traffic, notwithstanding trucks and things that are coming and going, but it's a lot less commuters. So I'm intrigued that there's that many people who, after the OCP just a few years ago, moved this into heavy industry, now are coming out to oppose this based on impacts that they're concerned about.
And certainly there's, with 8 hours of public hearing on this already, on the record, there are a number of things we haven't just had the time to talk about today that we won't have the time to talk about today. There's the dimension of it being close to the trail and people talking about that. There is the dimension of there have been people from Gabriola Island and Cedar who have spoken to the fact that, and Mudge Island, I should say, who have spoken to the fact that they feel like they are closer to this than most of the population of Nanaimo, but they aren't represented on Nanaimo City Council. So there are a lot of threads that are various things that people are raising in connection with this public hearing process. You have taken a look at this. You have spoken to a number of different aspects of this. Like, where do you see this going from here?
Well, I think council, if in terms of where it goes, I think it has, the way I would think about it is, what is the nature, maybe the strategic nature of the question that council has in front of it. So it can either be tone deaf to all the noise and all the opposition. Maybe noise is an impolite way of saying that. Just all the opposition and all the concerns. They can be tone deaf to it and just say enough. And council doesn't act as a whole. They act as individual votes. So maybe there's 5 votes on council that say, hey guys, we need industry. I think something to keep in mind, and they would probably reference this, is we need a lot more industrial land on the island. And there's almost no industrial land available here in the Capital Region District where I live. A few little parcels in the West Shore, Langford, Colwood area, maybe Souk, but these are not big industrial areas. And if by the time you get to Souk, you got a hellish road to get in and out of. The next time you're going to get some industrial land of any scale is probably North Cowichan and Duncan in that area. ALR's freezes so much land, and then Mosaic has all their forest lands. So finding industrial land, and for every person who moves into a community, you need another X square footage of industrial land. We all need industry. So Nanaimo in that last OCP put their hand up and said, we will be the industry. They brought on thousands of acres of big light and heavy industry. They said, we will be the industrial powerhouse of the Central Island, which is a really smart strategic decision for them to do that in the context of what's happening. So council, on one hand, has to weigh this. They have a competitive advantage and an opportunity to really fulfill this power, and long term, that's a powerful thing to do, is to build an industrial powerhouse around your town. But and that's because they've run out of industry, and what industry they had has been gentrified in many areas of these cities as people move in to the denser areas all over the island. So this is an opportunity for them. That's one hand. So maybe enough votes swing that way. The First Nations and the recognition of their ancestral territories here, their historical treaty territories, the modern treaty process that is still ongoing and being negotiated, and the historical archaeological uses and areas on the site, that creates quite a political, maybe a moral and political conundrum for each of the councillors to have to reckon with. Is we're the local government, so we govern land use, but we're not part of the treaty process. So I don't know what to do with that. So they've got some difficult decisions to do on that level, is the decision they make and its implications, partly morally, but largely substantively and practically in their ongoing relationships with Nanaimo, because Nanaimo are not going anywhere, and they're securing rights to a lot of the city and the area through their modern treaty negotiations, like real, basically fee simple development rights. So there's a decision, there's a relationship dynamic there they need to keep in mind. It's an election year. So to your point, folks on Gabriola, Mudge Island, outside of the boundaries of the city don't vote, but they do have an impact and a reputational impact for council. So there's a short-term political question in their minds of how many votes do I lose if I vote for this and proceed with it? What's that implication going to be to me? So they'll be thinking about that. And And then there's, the long-term financial well-being of the city, having industrial development, big money's paid, and ongoing. The taxes are very high for these for commercial lands, 2-3 times residential typically. So long-term, everyone's always short of money and needs more money. So that's a challenge. The employment realities, deep structural industry is very powerful in a city because you can run the risk of just becoming, restaurants and corner stores and shopping malls. You need production and industry to really anchor a town long term for prosperity. So they have a very difficult set of trade-offs. In the courses that I teach in being a professor and teaching public policy to planners, I explain public policy and these choices as a choice between 2 or 3 really bad options. Every choice you make has a serious trade-off. And every one of those ones I went through, like, if they don't, so they can decide to push back and, let's say, increase the setback to the trail, try and get a free park out of the deal, something like that. So they could try that. I think it's a question in everybody's mind as to 100 meters is quite a setback. That's like quite an unconventionally large setback from something like that. Is there a fundamental difference in 100 meters or 130 meters or 150 meters or 200 meters? What is that fundamentally, ecologically, and experientially going to be? That's a decision they need to think about if that's going to be a critical factor. So they're going to have to walk back to each of these individual components. Each of them in an election year have a constituency. So they're going to be deciding based on who their voters are. So, for instance, Paul Manley, pretty difficult to imagine him tromping all over environmental values. It's the Green Party, right? He was the candidate for the Green Party. So his constituency are environmental voters. So he's going to be paying very close attention to what the environmental voters are saying. He might be less interested in the economic prosperity from heavy industry, which often is polluting or partly polluting, uses a lot of natural gas and oil, and he's a climate guy. So, when you're part of a development team and you're working on these things, you start counting votes and you basically have to put yourself in their seat and go, every councillor has their own set of trade-offs based on the things that matter to them and what are their values. So this will be a very interesting process to watch and see, because Nanaimo's council is fairly diverse, and it'll be interesting to see how the votes land based on these different trade-offs.
Certainly, it's a situation where you hear this in some of the speakers in the framing, that it does seem like it would be easy to sort of frame this as environment versus the economy. But is that a fair, 100% fair framing? Like, is there some other option than vote this yes because you support the economy and vote this no because you support the environment?
In many cases, I think there's a both and. I've spent a lot of my life working on those both ands in my career. In this case, I'm not sure there is a big both and. Heavy industry is heavy industry, and it is an economic use. And like I say, the sites are pretty much leveled and cleared. In say a more urban environment with housing and gentler land uses, we can work entire urban ecosystems into those areas. We can have there's more money. The buildings, like commercial and residential buildings, there's a lot more money in play, so we can spend a bit more to get much higher energy efficiency. Industrial buildings are dumb boxes. They've got almost no insulation. They are not efficient. And as you work your way through the components of industrial, they're not a very friendly environmental use. I mean, you can put 1.5 inch green roof on the top of them, but that doesn't matter. That's not going to materially change the health of the ecosystem around here to have a little wee sedge roof on top of something. And you can't put much more than that because the big spans and the openness and most of these big industrial buildings, they can't take much weight. So yeah, we end up with a lot of limited ways to have a both and for environment and the economy in these situations on the site. Now, if we have a lot of commercial activity here and we're generating or building or producing, like in the case of greenhouses, they use a fair amount of energy, but you're producing food. And if the alternative is you don't have to ship as much food from the mainland, well, that's a real win, because shipping anything by sea is incredibly emissions. It's a very polluting way to move. So if you've got great big giant diesel engines grinding out there with the high carbon fuels, hauling every tomato and cucumber across the strait from warehouses in Abbotsford, well, maybe we should produce some of that here. That would be great. So I think the big story environmentally is a little more complicated, because depending on what happens here and what people produce, we could begin to push back against some of the inherent climate and environmental footprint that we otherwise might have. But with respect to an industrial site itself, that's larger thinking. The industrial site itself, it's really hard to have a both and. So I think some of the decision, and this site is big. This is a big piece of land, which was highlighted as a major piece of their industrial. It's a major cornerstone of their industrial lands. They've got some more in sandstone. They have a few other ones everywhere. But as soon as you start, if you want to be an industrial powerhouse, you start walking those pieces back at sizes of land this scale at a time, becomes an interesting challenge, which then comes back to City Hall and goes, well, if you're not going to approve this, what would you approve? You can't sterilize the land and make it a park without buying it. I mean, that's not honorable. So what would they approve? And are you just getting back to rural residential with people living on large lots and driving everywhere? Is that more environmentally friendly? I don't know. Maybe you'll probably have more tree cover. But yeah, something's going to happen on the land. So there's going to be a pro and a con to whatever is finally chosen.
Well, Mark Holland, there is a lot to this, and I really appreciate you taking the time to dive into it.
My pleasure.
Mark Holland is one of the principals at West Plan Consulting Group. He also teaches planning at Vancouver Island University. The public hearing we were discussing is set to resume Thursday, April 30th at 7 p.m. at the Vancouver Island Conference Center's Shaw Auditorium. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Fruit is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, you can email us at news@chly.ca. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. That's all for now. We'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.